My guest on the radio with me this morning, Dr. Brad Scoggins, is here from San Juan Health Partners Pediatrics. Good morning. Thanks for being here.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
You bet. Good to see you and have you here to talk about a number of issues that are going on in the community right now and in the country, I think, too, right now. But first and foremost, the thing that brings you here is this e-cigarettes that we're seeing. More and more adults and, I guess, teenagers, too, to a certain degree, starting to use these things, right?
Yeah, and it does seem like the age for starting to use e-cigarettes and products like that is getting younger. I think recently some data I saw was 20% of high school students have at least tried, and about 5% of middle school students have tried e-cigarettes. And unfortunately, we know the younger somebody starts smoking, and we'll consider e-cigarettes smoking for the purposes of addiction to nicotine, the likelihood that they're going to be a lifelong smoker is pretty high.
Interesting. And so I've seen a lot of these things that have been touted as the healthier alternative to cigarettes, but I imagine from some of the things that maybe you are exposed to and see, not so much.
Well, you know, I think there probably is good and bad to them. In fact, I just saw a study this last week that for people who are trying to quit cigarettes, that vaping and e-cigarettes might actually be a reasonable solution to help people quit, and in this one study had higher success rates in getting people to quit smoking. The problem is, especially from my end as a pediatrician, that, like I said, if people start smoking early or using nicotine, which as we know is probably one of the most addictive substances ever known to mankind, and we've got little receptors for it in our brain and muscle tissue and so forth, it's going to be hard to stop. And
these e-cigarettes still contain some form of nicotine, do they not?
Right, yeah, which is, again, why they're a little bit more successful in getting people to quit cigarette smoking, because they do fix that nicotine fix that people need.
Right.
Now, since they contain nicotine, and now that the flavorings in these products are so appealing to younger audiences, we have seen an increase in the number of ingestions accidentally by young toddlers who get into the syrup used for vaping, and they can have life-threatening reactions because nicotine in high quantities is definitely a toxin.
Right, and I'm not familiar exactly how these e-cigarettes work, but I would imagine that syrup is pretty highly concentrated.
That's true.
And so that's what they can get into, which you don't want that to happen.
In a very small dose, a very small amount, a very small volume of that syrup is enough to cause significant problems for young kids.
Right. So as a pediatrician, I imagine when these things came out, you must have been scratching your head or just shaking your head about, we're doing so well about trying to get kids away from cigarette smoking, and then out comes this new product that attracts them right back into it, I suppose,
right.
Or those potential habits.
That's
bad
right.
habits.
Yeah, and it touts itself as a healthier alternative, but unfortunately the research just doesn't bear that out.
So what types of things are happening with these e-cigarettes? I mean, I suppose anytime you're inhaling things into your lungs, that's not air, it can't be good for them. But I'm not a doctor, and you are, so explain to us what happens.
Sure, yeah. I mean, at a cellular level, damage is still happening. There are still chemicals that serve as carriers for the nicotine found in the syrup, and those, as Dr. Chopra can talk to you more about, he's actually a pulmonologist, but he can talk to you more about the direct cellular level toxicity of those compounds.
Right.
And then, of course, the addiction process that happens in the brain in response to nicotine is one that I think is just as important. Also, when we look at cigarette smoking and use of nicotine, a lot of the dangerous chemicals that are also found in that syrup cause a little bit of inflammation to the small blood vessels found throughout the body, and they increase risk of blood clots, and then, of course, early atherosclerotic heart disease, buildup of plaques in the arteries. So they're far from benign, and I think people think that because it's not technically considered smoking, number one, they don't answer the question, do you smoke, as a yes when they're using e-cigarettes. But then they also think that it's more acceptable to do them in other places. So we'll see people walking around grocery stores and shopping malls vaping, and we really don't know what the impact of secondhand vaping is going to have on people who are in the surrounding area.
That was going to be my next question, actually, about these long-term effects, because it's been around only just a few short years, and so maybe we don't know what these long-term effects are of just the vaping on the user's lungs as opposed to even the secondhand vape effects.
Right. Yeah, and I think we will find that they're going to be significant. We've known for a long time that with cigarette smoking, second and third hand smoke, and for those that don't know, third hand smoke is that what's left of the cigarette residue that lives that just exists in the dust in people's homes, lives on their clothes, or excuse me, stays on their clothes at all times. And people who are in those environments and constantly exposed to it, there's no way to get away from it.
Or in your car, I suppose,
car,
right?
Yep.
And so we've seen laws, I think, about some of these things about that. I don't think you can smoke in a car with a child anymore.
I don't think you're supposed to.
Right.
Yeah, and I certainly would advise against it.
Right. And in a lot of people's homes as well. I think a lot of folks, if they are going to smoke, they will go outside, maybe for part of that reason, I suppose.
Right, and going outside helps a little bit. What I always try to tell people to do is make their regimen surrounding smoking so intrusive that it pushes them to quit. So if you got to change your jacket, brush your teeth, wash your hair every time you come in and out for a cigarette, maybe it'll encourage you to stop.
Right. I mean, and again, I don't know, there shouldn't be anyone alive today that doesn't know the inherent dangers of cigarette smoking. I think we've done a pretty good job of trying to educate folks, yet people still do it. So
right.
It's human nature, I suppose, that
that's true.
We try to do some of these things that aren't good for us.
Right. And that's what nicotine does. The fact that it's so addictive, it teaches your brain to demand it and to expect it. And of course, the reward for the next cigarette or the next, I don't even know what they call the vaping, what the term for that is,
right.
but for the next ingestion of nicotine-containing substance, that reward is great.
And as a pediatrician, are younger lungs more susceptible to damage than older, life-hardened lungs, or lungs that have been through a few years, but lungs are still developing? I mean, what do you find?
Certainly, yeah. We always talk, even in older adults, we always talk about the aggregate lifetime exposure to cigarettes. In fact, if you smoke 2 cigarettes a day for 25 years, we consider that a 50-pack year smoking history. So there's definitely an aggregate effect. The longer you smoke, and we find it used to be that kids would start at the age of 11 or 12 and never stop. So you can imagine when you reach the age of 60, you've got 50 years of smoking already on you.
Right.
And that's not going to be good for lung cancer and COPD. People you see walking around pushing oxygen tanks with them, a lot of the times that's the reason. That's
some of those issues, right? Emphysema,
Absolutely.
Those types of things too, right? That show up later in life, I suppose, in many of these people. So that's what we're talking about. And again, these e-cigarettes, the idea is that they may cause some of these same long-term issues, even if we don't have studies to show it yet. Right. Yeah. There's, like you pointed out earlier, they're so new. I don't think we really know the full impact. But safe to say that foreign substances with the necessary chemicals to keep those compounds stable. We just don't know what the impact is yet. Right. And I know we all think that our government would protect us from some of these things, or regulate them, or at least help to. I don't want to make this a political show, but there are certainly, maybe, hopefully, some safeguards. Maybe they're not as bad as they could be. Is that a correct thing to say? I don't know. Well, to my knowledge, the e-cigarette market is not terribly well regulated, and in fact there's been a big push from the American Academy of Pediatrics and a few other professional organizations to lobby Congress to make some stricter restrictions on these, to stop using some of the flavorings and some of the marketing, kind of like we've seen with cigarettes in the past. I don't know if you remember as a kid, candy cigarettes. I sure love those things. Yeah, that's right. Exactly. Yeah. And I believe you have a hard time finding those any longer. Right. But the same thing is true with the e-cigarette market. Yeah. And it's funny you mentioned regulation in its many forms, and we've known for years that the supplement and vitamin markets are not regulated by the FDA, and I think that I think the e-cigarette manufacturers have sort of fallen in under that similar
flying under the radar, so to speak. So yeah, I think we will see more regulation on it, but it's not there yet.
I see. And you'd think some of the flavors, as you mentioned, because these things come in all kinds of different flavors, and again, it's America, it's free enterprise. I suppose everyone has a right to have their business, but if their business causes health problems, then there are some concerns about that, legitimate. And some of these flavors, is the point I was trying to make, is it seem to be really targeted at younger people, almost like the Joe Camels of our other generations.
Yeah, exactly right. Yeah, trying to target those, trying to target really kids, honestly, and trying to get them hooked early, so you get a lifelong 50-year smoker out of a marketing effort. Yeah.
Right. And again, the differences in between. I mean, again, these things are not on fire, these e-cigarettes. I mean, so you're just ingesting this vapor, I suppose. Better than cigarette smoke for your lungs, or is it still, as I mentioned, it's still causing damage, but is it a better, less damage?
That I don't think we fully know yet. Yeah, I would enter it in with the assumption that it's probably not any better.
Got it.
Yeah.
Nothing about the burning smoke that causes more damage or not than something else?
Maybe less carbon monoxide.
Okay.
Maybe, they talk about there being, 30-something chemicals in cigarette smoke. Maybe a few less of those chemicals, but I don't think we can assume it's safe.
Right.
Yeah.
So in young people that you see in your practice, when they come in, whether they smoke cigarettes or they're smoking e-cigarettes or what have you, but they want to be that student athlete, or they want to be able to run the track, they want to be able to play football or basketball or baseball or all these different things. I imagine if your lung capacity is diminished, you have a harder time doing all these things.
Yeah, that's very true. Yeah, very true. Just like with cigarette smoking, I think we'll probably find diminished lung capacity. Another thing to point out is for people with asthma, for people with kids who have asthma, having this kind of vapor around is not safe for that. In fact, I have a handful of patients, to say the least, who have a hard time getting over their asthma. They get sick frequently, and one of the common denominators is their exposure to smoke.
Not helping their condition.
Oh, not at all.
I suppose. Interesting. No. My guest this morning, Dr. Brad Scoggins, is here from San Juan Health Partners Pediatrics. We're talking about the dangers of e-cigarettes, some of the things that you've been looking at, and some of these. I imagine there's still ongoing studies about this because they are so new, and trying to track what exactly we are looking at, if we could see a longer-term health problem on the horizon.
Yeah, and I'm afraid we will. Yeah, along similar lines, not to jump topics too quickly, but we've seen increased use of marijuana also, and people assuming it's safe because governments have declared that it's okay to use for recreational use. We're starting to see use in younger and younger kids, and just like with the accidental ingestions with syrups for the vaping, we'll see edibles accidentally falling into the hands of young kids, and some not desirable reactions that we've had.
Right.
Yeah.
And a lot of folks say that marijuana is maybe healthier, if you could say that, than cigarette smoke, marijuana smoke, or smoking marijuana. I don't know.
I don't think we can say that yet.
Okay.
The Academy of Pediatrics, again, I'll reference them because they've been pretty vocal in this space. They have recommended pretty strongly against the use of marijuana in young kids. One of the things that we hoped for recently with the medical marijuana scene was for seizures to be helped significantly by it. And there was a great story out of Colorado just a couple of years ago where this young girl had been on several seizure medicines, continued to have dozens of seizures a day. They put her on cannabis, I believe it was cannabis oil, but I could be wrong about that. And it seemed to slow the seizures down, made national headlines, was very sensational, and then unfortunately that little girl went back to having multiple seizures a day, kind of like she'd responded to all the previous anti-epileptic drugs. It didn't seem to hold the promise that we hoped for.
Interesting. Yeah. But it's still, a lot of folks still hold it up as potentially helpful in some other issues, though, too. We've seen it for medical use for a number of years already, right? It's legal in this state for medical use, and so it does have its benefits in some cases.
It can, yeah. I mean, certainly we know in cancer patients, and for them not only to help with nausea, but to stimulate appetite and to help with pain. Yes, those things I think are fairly well known. But at this point, I think we're kind of limited to those uses of marijuana as far as establishing its safety. things like early onset Alzheimer's disease, poor school functioning, those have all been tied to marijuana use, particularly regular use.
Sure. And for recreation use, as folks are out and about, I mean, again, they can be as impaired as someone under the influence of alcohol, I would think.
Oh, without question. Yeah.
And-
Without question.
And if we're smoking it, again, the lung issues are what we've already talked about, right? When you're inhaling anything into your lungs, that's going to cause damage
Right. Yeah, very true.
and potential long-term damage.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Interesting. Let's take a short break. When we come back, we have a couple more topics to talk about. I want to ask you about the flu because we are still in the midst of flu season, I think.
Oh, yeah.
And some other things going on as well. So stay right there.
Sounds good.
Back with my guest with more in just a moment, everybody, right here on KSJE.